This is the moment Iran's 30-year strategy in the Persian Gulf stopped working. Imagine you are standing on the bridge of an IRGC patrol boat somewhere near the Strait of Hormuz at dawn on April 14, 2026. You look out at the water. Something is wrong. The sea is quiet, too quiet. The tankers that normally move through this channel every single hour are gone. The cargo ships are gone. The freighters are gone. What you see instead is gray steel, lots of it. 3 U.S. Navy carrier strike groups sitting in the water like an iron wall. And then, at exactly 6 a.m. Gulf Standard Time on Monday, April 14, 2026, the U.S. Secretary of Defense walked to the podium at the Pentagon and said 11 words that changed everything. The United States has begun enforcing a full naval embargo on Iran. Not a warning, not a threat, not a diplomatic note. An actual live enforced naval embargo backed by 2 aircraft carriers, 14 guided missile destroyers, and the most advanced naval surveillance technology on the planet. Iran already staggering under the weight of a collapsed rial, empty government reserves, and a population that has not forgotten the protests of 2019 and 2022 has just been hit with the single most devastating economic weapon the United States has used against any country since the blockade of Iraq in the 1990s. In this deep dive, we are going to show you exactly what this embargo means for Iran's economy, why Iran's so-called resistance strategy just collapsed in real time, what happened behind closed doors between Iran's top commanders in the 48 hours before this announcement, and what the next 14 days will look like, because those 14 days may determine whether this ends at a negotiating table or somewhere far more dangerous. Iran isn't just losing a diplomatic standoff. Iran is losing the only card it had left to play. To understand how catastrophic this moment is, you have to go back roughly 4 years. In 2022, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei made a bold decision. He approved a strategy that his military commanders had been pushing for years, what they called the Strait Leverage Doctrine. The plan was simple but dangerous. Iran would gradually build up its control over the Strait of Hormuz. It would station fast attack boats, lay defensive mines, develop missile systems pointed at the Gulf shipping lanes, and, most importantly, maintain the constant threat of closure. The logic was clean. If Iran could credibly threaten to shut down 20% of the world's oil supply, the world would never dare push Iran too hard on sanctions, on nuclear talks, or on anything else. And for a while, it worked. Europe stayed cautious. China kept buying Iranian oil at discount prices and said nothing publicly. The Biden administration tiptoed around any real confrontation. Iran collected billions in quiet oil revenue through what analysts politely call a shadow fleet. Tankers with switched-off transponders and fake flags sailing Iranian crude to refineries in China and Malaysia. The plan was supposed to deliver Iran a kind of permanent insurance policy. Khamenei promised his inner circle this was Iran's golden leverage, the key that would keep the country economically alive no matter what Washington did. But the cost of this plan was not just military. It meant Iran had to become more aggressive in the Gulf. It meant attacking neutral civilian shipping to prove it was serious. A Thai-flagged vessel was targeted by IRGC speedboats. A Panamanian cargo ship was harassed near the strait. Iran began charging vessels transit fees, up to $1.5 million per ship, just to pass through international waters that legally belong to everyone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Iran's leadership gambled that the United States would never respond with a full naval embargo because the economic fallout would hit the whole world, not just Iran. They assumed Washington would never accept the political cost of 100 per barrel oil. They assumed wrong. At 5:47 a.m. Gulf Standard Time on Monday morning, before the official Pentagon announcement, something happened that ship captains across the Persian Gulf noticed immediately. The U.S. Navy's communication channels, the standard maritime frequencies used across the region, went from routine traffic to a single repeating message. All vessels, all nations were being told, if your destination is an Iranian port, turn around now, not in an hour, now. For approximately 9 minutes, the frequency was completely silent after that broadcast. Then the responses started coming in. Within 40 minutes, vessel tracking service data showed 23 cargo ships had changed their AIS transponder destinations. The digital tags that tell the world where a ship is going, from Iranian ports to Omani anchorages, from Bandar Abbas to open sea holding patterns, from Karg Island routes to full reversal headings back toward UAE waters. The Strait of Hormuz, a channel that normally handles between 18 and 22 million barrels of oil per day, was functionally shutting down for Iranian-bound traffic in real time before a single U.S. Navy vessel had physically intercepted anyone. That is how powerful the credibility of American naval force is. Ships did not wait to see if the U.S. was bluffing. They turned around because nobody in commercial shipping wants to be the test case. While all of this was happening on the water, something equally important was happening in global oil markets. Brent crude, which had been trading at approximately $82 per barrel at Friday's close, jumped to $96 within the first 90 minutes of Monday trading. Goldman Sachs' commodity desk published a flash note at 7:15 a.m. London time warning clients that if the embargo held for more than 72 hours, $110 per barrel was not just possible, it was likely. While the markets were reacting and ships were turning around, Iran's state media was running a very different story. Iranian state television was broadcasting a press conference where IRGC General Hossein Salami was calling the embargo illegal, an act of aggression, and a desperate move by a declining empire. He called on all resistance forces to be ready. And at that exact same moment, while the general was giving that press conference, Iran's own central bank was quietly releasing internal data showing the country's foreign currency reserves had dropped to approximately $4 billion. $4 billion. That is less than 3 weeks of import costs for a country of 88 million people. The market doesn't care about press conferences. The market cares about reserves. And $4 billion is not a war chest. It is a countdown clock. Here is the number that tells the full story. Iran produces roughly 3.2 million barrels of crude oil per day. It can only realistically export about 1.4 million of those barrels because the rest goes to domestic consumption. That export revenue, approximately $112 million per day at current prices, is the financial oxygen of the Iranian government. Pay the military with it. Pay the subsidies that keep bread prices from exploding with it. Pay government salaries with it. The embargo just cut off that oxygen. Here's what you have not heard anywhere else today. According to sources inside the Iranian parliament who spoke to regional outlets over the weekend, an emergency session of the Supreme National Security Council was held at a classified location north of Tehran on Saturday night, 36 hours before the U.S. announcement. The participants at that table: Supreme Leader Khamenei's chief military advisor, 3 senior IRGC commanders, the acting foreign minister, Iran's central bank governor, and a representative from the office of President Pezeshkian. The topic was simple and terrifying. What do we do if Washington actually does this? According to what leaked from that meeting, the IRGC commanders were divided. One faction, the hardliners, wanted to immediately activate Houthi missile systems in Yemen and threaten Gulf Arab shipping as leverage. Their argument: make the pain global, make China and Europe pressure Washington to back down. The other faction, the pragmatists, had a different assessment. They laid out a spreadsheet on the table. Iran's oil storage facilities are currently at roughly 68% capacity. The country is producing oil that has nowhere to go. If exports are blocked for just 21 days, Iran will have to begin shutting down active oil wells. And every time you shut down a well in Iran's aging fields, you lose between 8% and 12% of that well's future output, permanently. The damage is not reversible. One of the IRGC commanders present reportedly said, "We built this strategy on the assumption that they would blink first. What if they don't blink?" The room went quiet. The central bank governor then placed a single sheet of paper on the table. On it was one number: Iran's usable foreign exchange reserves, money it could actually spend, not frozen assets, not gold, not theoretical figures, $3.8 billion. After that number was placed on the table, the meeting shifted. The conversation stopped being about how to escalate. It started being about how to buy time without appearing to surrender. The result: Iran's foreign ministry drafted a back-channel message to Omani diplomats. Oman has served as a quiet intermediary between Tehran and Washington for decades, requesting that a new round of indirect talks be arranged urgently. That message was sent at 2:14 a.m. Tehran time on Sunday. Washington received it, and Washington chose to announce the embargo anyway. That decision, to announce the embargo even after receiving Iran's back-channel message, was deliberate. It was a signal: We are not negotiating from fear anymore. Why would the United States do something this economically disruptive? Follow the power calculation. Washington has watched Iran run the straight leverage doctrine for 4 years. Every time the US pushed on nuclear talks, Iran would rattle the strait. Every time sanctions were tightened, Iran would harass a tanker. The message from Tehran was always the same: back off or we make the whole world pay. The problem with that strategy is that it only works if the other side believes the cost of confrontation is higher than the cost of inaction. Washington just decided the cost of inaction, a nuclear-capable Iran with permanent Gulf leverage, is now higher than the cost of $100 oil. This is a massive power shift. It moves control of the strait's narrative from Tehran to Washington. Iran could threaten to close the strait because it controlled access. Now the US controls access, and it is using that control not to close the strait, but to surgically cut off Iran while keeping everyone else's oil flowing. Saudi tankers are moving. Iraqi tankers are moving. UAE tankers are moving. Only Iranian-bound vessels are being turned around. That is genius-level strategic framing. Because now when Iran threatens to close the strait entirely in retaliation, Iran becomes the country threatening to destroy the global economy, not the United States. Iran becomes the aggressor. China's 50% Gulf oil dependency suddenly becomes pressure on Beijing to tell Tehran to stand down, not pressure on Washington to lift the embargo. The legal dimension adds another layer of complexity. Under international maritime law, a blockade is only legal if it is officially declared, enforced impartially, and allows humanitarian cargo through. The US appears to have studied this carefully. The Pentagon's formal announcement, the CENTCOM notices to mariners issued 6 hours before the embargo began, and the explicit exemptions for food, medicine, and humanitarian shipments all check the legal boxes. Iran's counterclaim that this is piracy carries no weight in any international legal forum because Iran itself spent the past 2 years charging illegal transit fees and seizing neutral vessels in the same waterway. History will call this moment the end of the straight leverage era. Iran built its entire geopolitical identity around the threat of Hormuz. That threat just became worthless. Here is the domino effect that almost nobody is talking about clearly enough. If the embargo holds for 14 days, Iranian oil wells begin mandatory shutdowns. Permanent production loss of 8 to 12% per well. If those shutdowns happen, government revenue collapses by an additional 30% on top of what the embargo is already cutting. If government revenue collapses at that level, Iran cannot pay military salaries in full. When military salaries go unpaid in a country that is already sitting on decades of civilian frustration, that is when regimes face their most dangerous internal moments. This is not speculation. This is the exact sequence of events that preceded the collapse of several authoritarian governments over the past 30 years. The economic clock in Tehran is ticking louder than any missile launch could. While Iran's economic situation is becoming critical inside the country, the geopolitical watchers around the world are recalculating fast. China is watching this very carefully, and Beijing is deeply uncomfortable. Here is why. China buys approximately 13% of its crude oil directly from Iran. But far more importantly, China gets nearly 52% of its total oil supply from Gulf states whose tankers move through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran closing the strait in retaliation would hurt China catastrophically. Beijing has a very clear incentive to pressure Tehran to de-escalate. Sources in the diplomatic community say Chinese officials have already made 2 phone calls to Tehran in the past 48 hours. The message translated from diplomatic language into plain English: don't make this worse. Russia is watching too, and Russia's position is quietly shifting. Moscow has been Iran's diplomatic shield at the UN Security Council for years, vetoing sanctions resolutions and providing political cover. But Russia is also an oil exporter. $100 Brent crude is actually good for Russia's revenue. A prolonged Hormuz crisis that keeps oil prices elevated is not entirely against Russian interests. Kremlin sources have not publicly supported Iran's position since the embargo was announced. That silence speaks volumes. And then there is the coalition fracture inside Iran itself. The pragmatist faction inside the IRGC, the commanders who argued for buying time at Saturday's emergency session, is now in direct conflict with the hardliner faction that wants to escalate. Sources close to the Iranian parliament say the debate inside the security establishment is now open and bitter. One hardline commander was reportedly overheard saying, "We should have never let them think we were willing to negotiate. Now they see weakness." The pragmatist reportedly replied, "What you call weakness, reality calls arithmetic." A divided Iranian security establishment cannot execute a coherent response. And that internal fracture may be the most dangerous thing happening in Tehran right now. Not because it makes Iran more likely to negotiate, but because it makes Iran's next move unpredictable. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. For the Iranian government, it was a symbol. It was proof that a country under maximum pressure, under sanctions, under isolation, under military threat, could still hold the whole world hostage from a 34-mile-wide channel of water. It was the proof that the Islamic Republic was too important to be destroyed, too strategically positioned to be ignored, too dangerous to be confronted directly. Khamenei wanted permanent relevance. He ended up with a naval embargo and $3.8 billion in usable reserves. You can spin a press conference. You cannot spin an empty oil tanker dock. You can produce propaganda for your domestic audience. You cannot produce foreign currency reserves out of state television broadcasts. Reality has a way of arriving whether or not you have invited it. So where does this stand right now? Iran's supreme leader is reportedly in a mountain retreat facility north of Tehran, a location used for high security deliberations. The IRGC is on combat alert, but 3 of its most senior naval officers have, according to regional security sources, privately told intermediaries they do not believe Iran can win a direct naval confrontation with the current U.S. force deployment. Iran's parliament speaker has made loud public statements, but loud public statements do not reopen oil export terminals. The international community has not closed the door. Oman is still in contact with both sides. Pakistan's foreign ministry issued a statement calling for renewed dialogue through established channels. Even the European Union, which has consistently criticized U.S. unilateral action in the Gulf, has said publicly that Iran must end its illegal toll collection and allow free navigation to resume. The next 14 days will define this decade in the Middle East. Iran can choose escalation, activate the Houthis in Yemen, threaten Gulf Arab shipping, attempt to challenge U.S. vessels at sea. That path leads to a military response that Iran, with $3.8 billion in reserves and a degraded navy, cannot sustain. Every analyst who has looked at the force comparison says the same thing privately. Iran's military capability in the Gulf is roughly 30% of what it was 5 years ago. Iran can choose a middle path, back-channel negotiations, public defiance combined with private concessions, a face-saving formula where it agrees to stop the tolls and open the strait in exchange for some sanctions relief. That path requires the regime to admit, at least internally, that the strait leverage doctrine failed. Or, and this is the scenario that should concern everyone most, Iran's internal divisions produce no coherent decision at all. The hardliners block negotiation. The pragmatists block escalation. And the country drifts into a 3rd week of embargo with oil wells shutting down, reserves draining, and public frustration building in a way that the IRGC will eventually have to respond to with force, not against America, but against its own people. The dam was not broken by the U.S. Navy. It was broken by 4 years of a strategy built on a bluff that the other side finally called. Iran had one card. It played it. It did not work. Subscribe and enable notifications right now, because in the next 72 to 96 hours, Iran will have to make one of the most consequential decisions it has made in 40 years. When that decision comes, we will break it down the moment it happens, with the depth and clarity you will not find anywhere else. Watch closely. The clock in Tehran is running.